getting hotter and hotter, sexy and hotter. Will South Carolina shut the Union down? We'll find out today because we're taking a look at the Nullification Crisis, South Carolina Exposition, and a wonderful example of the battle between state rights versus the federal government. And two of the three things that you heard in that song are going to happen today. It is about to get hotter and hotter. Tensions are rising, blood is boiling, as South Carolina is going to threaten to leave the Union, shut the Union down, but it won't get sexier because these two men will be at the center of this controversy, and neither one of these guys can be accused of being sexy. Now here's the big idea why it's getting hotter. Federal government attempts to assert authority over the states brought resistance from state governments in both the North and the South at different times. Today we're going to take a look at that resistance in the South. And really at the center of this issue is the issue of tariffs. And if you recall, tariffs are intended to protect American industry against competition from European manufactured goods. And while this is a wonderful thing if you're an American manufacturer, the problem is if you're not, it makes things more expensive. It drives prices up, and it also causes other nations to pass tariffs as well against American goods. And so throughout American history, all the way back under George Washington, anytime the issue of tariffs came up, Southerners largely said no. No. They don't want nothing to do with them. They see this as sectional legislation benefiting the North. When Hamilton's tariff was up, Southerners were opposing it. During the American system, the protective tariff of 1816, largely opposed by Southerners. And so what you see is from the Southern perspective, there is this perception that
from the North to the South, welcome to the South.
The South is being stuck with the bill paying for northern and middle state, places like New York or Pennsylvania, manufacturing. And it's not just about tariffs, it's this fear that the federal government, what if they pass a bill aimed at slavery? You know, what if they decide that they're going to interfere with the institution of slavery like they did at the Talmadge Amendment? Even though that wasn't passed, Southerners are really anxious about this issue. And so there's this resistance to any federal government attempts to kind of step on what they perceive as their state rights. And in 1828, Congress passes the Tariff of 1828, and it is once again a tax. It is a very high protective tariff, and once again, Southerners see this as favoring Northern industry. And when the tariff is passed, and so there's a political crisis, because Southerners, in fact, South Carolina, amongst other states, they refer to this tariff as the Tariff of Abominations. And they meet, and in the South Carolina legislature, they publish something called the South Carolina Exposition, written secretly by the Vice President John C. Calhoun. And they condemned the tariff. They said that this tariff is unconstitutional. In fact, this is going to kind of spark something called the Nullification Crisis. Because in this South Carolina Exposition, they state that they have the right, the states have the right to nullify the tariff, to declare it null and void. They will not enforce it within their state. And if you recall, this was something that we saw similarly under the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions of 1798. Now, they don't actually vote on nullification. They need a 2/3 vote. They don't have enough votes to get that, but they're talking about it and they're criticizing this tariff of 1828, the Tariff of Abominations. Now, there's this kind of famous moment where Andrew Jackson, the president at the time, and the vice president are at this dinner, and Jackson does the toast where he says, "Our federal union, it must be preserved." And John C. Calhoun follows it up with, "The union, next to our liberties, the most dear." And this kind of fundamentally shows you the different views about the union and the role of the federal government and the states within that union. Now, Congress kind of sets the crisis in motion when they decide in 1832, tick-tock goes another one. Tick-tock, They pass another tariff. They pass the Tariff of 1832. And South Carolina wastes no time. They call a special convention in the state legislature, and the Nullies, the people who supported nullification, this time they win. Because they vote, and they basically say in 1832, the tariff, it's no más, no more. We're not going to collect the tariff within the state of South Carolina. And if you try to enforce this, if you try to force this, we will possibly leave the Union. We threaten secession. And so South Carolina basically, draws the line in the sand and says this tariff is no more in the state of South Carolina. And the Nullies win because they vote on this ordinance of nullification. And what you need to keep in mind is this is a tense moment. And Andrew Jackson, who's the president, is not an advocate of tariffs. He's not a strong federal government type guy. He was a supporter of state rights. But he also is the president of the United States, and he has to, represent this idea of
Don't want none unless you got.
there will not be disunion. There will not be defiance. And Jackson wants to kind of go in there with the military and hang all of the nullifiers. He openly says that. And you have this brink of civil war. The nation is on the brink of civil war. He prepares the military, and of course, as in many moments in American history, cooler heads luckily prevail. And to avoid a bigger crisis, two things happen. One, compromise.
It's gonna compromise. It's gonna compromise. Oh.
Your boy, Senator Henry Clay, uses his influence in Congress to get a compromise tariff of 1833 passed. And this would gradually reduce the tariff rates. And Southerners are cool. They're like, all right, we accept that. The other piece, though, is Andrew Jackson at the same time says if you don't pay the tariff,
213 will regulate.
we're going to regulate. And the force bill is passed, and it basically says Jackson, the president, has the right to use military force to collect federal tariff duties. And sometimes this is referred to as the olive branch and the sword. We're going to kind of compromise, but also we're going to show you who's the boss. And South Carolina wants to back down. There's no other southern states really coming to their defense. There's a lot of pro-union people in South Carolina, and the situation kind of resolves itself when it could have been a civil war, a really bad crisis. And of all the people involved, the real MVP
You're the real MVP.
is Henry Clay. Because by working his magic, his compromise, he constantly is doing this. He avoids a bigger conflict, an armed conflict that could have turned into a civil war. And while the nullification crisis is resolved, it is important to keep in mind, as the decades move on, it's going to be increasingly difficult to reach compromise. And of course, we all know how this story is going to end, because eventually South Carolina will leave the Union along with a bunch of other southern states, and we'll have a little event called the Civil War. Until next time, make sure you subscribe, like the video, and keep learning. Become a U.S. history beast. Expand that mind. Peace.